Here again is Jane Pauley.
For millions of parents, adoption is a dream come true. A family as firmly rooted in love and tradition as any with biological roots. But life can be a mystery sometimes, and for one young couple who already had 3 biological children, the addition of their 2 adopted daughters, sisters, became a mystery that only deepened as the years went by. What they didn't know about the girls' earliest years would haunt them all for years to come. Giving unconditional love would be much harder than they could ever have imagined. Here's Margaret Larson.
The story of the Lux family began as most do, with a wedding. 2 academics with promising careers. Mike Lux was a professor of philosophy, a rising star at Notre Dame, and a professor of literature at nearby St. Mary's. Before long, there were children, a girl, then 2 boys. Ann and Mike bought a comfortable suburban home in South Bend, Indiana. They seemed to have it all. In fact, so much, it felt natural to share it. But nothing in their world prepared them for the kind of pain those good intentions could cause.
We both had wanted a larger family, and we somehow thought that 3 biological children was probably enough biological children.
And we never joined the Peace Corps or the Papal Volunteers, so we thought we could adopt children.
An agency handling welfare department adoptions offered 2 girls, sisters, Sandy, who was almost 4, and Julie, a year younger. The Luxes say they were told the girls' mother loved them, but couldn't keep them because of a drinking problem.
We had also been told that they were abused and neglected.
They say the social worker didn't volunteer details, and the Luxes didn't press for any. At the time, they didn't think it mattered, believing a loving home and a fresh start could conquer anything. They took their 3 kids to meet the girls at the zoo.
We thought they were marvelous. We just fell in love with them instantly. They were so cute, they were so tiny, they were so sweet, they were so vulnerable.
Over popcorn and treats at the petting farm, Mike and Ann decided to adopt them.
Sandy was real delicate, Julie was real kind of funny and smiley, and they just charmed us.
They were little and cute.
Joe, the middle child, was 6 then. Lori, the oldest, was 7.
We had lots of romantic visions, at least my sisters and I did, of how the 3 of us would live together. I didn't have any sisters when my sisters came.
Just 3 weeks after they met, Sandy and Julie came to live with the Luxes for good.
Each one of them had a brown paper bag, grocery bag of clothes, and 1 stuffed animal.
And a scrapbook from their foster mother. A few photographs, old Valentines, and a lock of Sandy's hair were all that had been saved of the girls' past.
They loved the house. They went all over the house, and they went in all the bedrooms and all the closets. They were happy here. They seemed to be happy here.
It all started with such high hopes, the Luxes had no idea what was coming. The adoption agency had held back an extensive file on the girls, information about the traumas they had suffered in their young lives. Without those details, Ann and Mike were almost totally unequipped to handle what would happen next.
When did you first notice with each of the girls that there might be problems here that you had not anticipated?
The first day.
The first day?
The first day.
From the very start, there were signs of trouble. At the backyard picnic table, when dinner was over, everyone got up to play, except Julie.
She cried, she whimpered, she just didn't want to move on. She wanted to keep on eating.
No matter how they tried to convince her she was full, Julie just wanted more, eating as though she could never get enough. In the meantime, 4-year-old Sandy was busy dumping buckets of sand all over the lawn.
And so I would go up to her and say, okay, now let's keep the sand in the sandbox. And she couldn't hear me. She couldn't understand what I was saying.
What do you mean, she was just glazed over?
She just looked off into the distance. And we just weren't communicating at all. It was an eerie feeling.
Did it scare you?
It did, enormously.
That night, things got worse. As Sandy slept on the top bunk in the girls' room, she rocked violently.
And she actually rocked so much that the bed and the trundle bed shook.
You could hear it. You could hear in the living room, the thrashing. Sandy would thrash in the bed, cast herself from one side of the bed to the other, really shake the floor upstairs.
I remember thinking, boy, this is really weird.
For months afterwards, Lori had to sleep on a cot inside the closet to escape the racket.
And you just think, this is not right. There's something behind this kind of behavior. What dreams was she having? What was she working out? It was as if she were trying to escape something.
In those first days, Ann and Mike were worried enough to consult the social worker, who seemed to think the girls just needed to settle in. But time didn't help. Julie, the little girl who wouldn't leave the picnic table, sneaked into cupboards and ate whatever she could find, whole bags of cookies, 30 pieces of gum.
She couldn't spend time in the kitchen alone because she would simply go and eat.
And she would eat continuously?
If allowed, yes.
Ann and Mike were so taken up with Julie's food problems, they almost didn't notice what Sandy was doing. She'd begun taking things from around the house, hiding them in her room, always detached and never wanting to be touched.
The image of her as someone sort of creeping around the house, crawling around underneath the table and things like this.
Less than a month after they'd taken the girls in, Ann and Mike felt their family life spinning out of control. So they arranged for a meeting at the welfare office, now ready to search out more about the girls' past. Reluctantly, a caseworker revealed part of their file.
And she would read out sentences to us and ask us if this is what we wanted to know. And after every sentence, she would say, is this enough?
They say what they were told was overwhelming. The girls' parents were both alcoholics. The children had shuttled in and out of foster care, never living anywhere for more than 6 months. Julie had been hospitalized at 3 months for malnutrition. Sandy had been taken away repeatedly after social workers found bruises all over her face. The details were so painful, Ann and Mike said no more. They'd heard enough.
Did you have a sense at that point that you might be in over your head?
Yeah.
Did you think about saying, I can't do this?
No.
They felt they'd made a commitment and couldn't go back, so they tried to ignore their apprehension, certain they could shape the girls to fit into the family. After all, they were only 3 and 4 years old.
The assumption sort of is you're going to make them fit the mold you've already got going there. And I think it's very hard to overcome that attitude.
But over the next few years, Ann and Mike's confidence was replaced with frustration and anger. Instead of settling in, the girls' behavior became more disruptive. Both girls continually lied, took things from the other kids, and refused to apologize. And they seemed unwilling or unable to follow even simple directions.
They did things over and over and over and never could seem to predict that the result would be the same.
Ann and Mike's relief to get them into elementary school was short-lived. Before long, their teachers were complaining. The girls couldn't sit still, couldn't concentrate, couldn't seem to learn. Ann and Mike hired tutors and took them to doctors and therapists, but nothing seemed to help. Not knowing what else to do, they poured on the discipline, more rules, more structure. All that did was make everyone angrier.
Ann and I would lay awake at night and talk and talk and talk about how it just wasn't working and how we couldn't deal with the problems. And then we'd try to convince ourselves it would all get better.
Through it all, they worried they were neglecting their biological children. Tension in the house was a constant.
I can see my mom in the back door with a look of real stress on her face, but I can't remember why.
Despite consultation with experts, Julie's eating problems persisted. At school, a teacher found her rooting through the garbage looking for scraps of food. At home, sweets had to be hidden in the car trunk to keep them away from her.
food couldn't be a kind of source of joy and a center of family life. Going into a restaurant and having a meal, that was a problem.
Even 7 years after her adoption, when Julie was in the 4th grade, the school nurse caught her stuffing herself with other kids' leftovers. Ann and Mike were worn down, irritable, knowing now that their impatience had become part of the problem.
Did you think you were a bad parent?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I surely did. That we just weren't successful in dealing with these problems.
Ann's stress was compounded by a gut-wrenching guilt. Deep down, she knew her adopted daughters needed acceptance and love. But to her horror, what she felt was resentment.
I would go in to kiss them at night, and I would think, I don't want to kiss them as much as I want to kiss this other child. And I was always coming up short, judging myself, not doing this right.
And the adopted daughters in your family could feel that.
Oh, there is no question. They were so sensitive. And I knew they could feel it. That makes the guilt so much worse. I knew they knew.
Mike, too, was feeling guilty and inadequate as an adoptive parent, and because of that, he cringed at the praise of friends and colleagues.
The kind of constant reaction of people was, what a wonderful thing you're doing, what saints you are, what great moral heroes you are. And we knew that we were botching it, we weren't doing things well.
In some ways, blaming themselves was easier than considering the alternative.
There is the thought, there's constantly the thought that perhaps there's nothing you can do.
Had the girls been forever damaged by early childhood traumas? In those first years, the Luxes had come a long way from their initial assumptions that love would come easily, that a fresh start could fix everything.
We really believed that love would conquer all. We believed that environment was the whole story with children.
What do you think now?
I don't think that.
But whatever they'd experienced so far, it was nothing compared to what was just around the corner, the girls' teenage years.
When we return, Mike and Ann would need all their strength to face the trials that were to follow.
From Los Angeles, here again is Stone Phillips.
Returning now to our story, the teenage years can be a challenge for any family. But for the Luxes, those years brought trouble far worse than anything they could have foreseen. Trouble that threatened to shatter their family. Could they stay together? Once again, here's Margaret Larson.
10 years after their adoptions, as they hit adolescence, Sandy and her younger sister Julie seemed to completely switch roles in the family. Julie's compulsive eating had put her center stage throughout their elementary school years. Sandy had been the quiet one, so withdrawn her parents called her their disappearing child. But all that changed when Sandy became a teenager and went wild.
Those years were a nightmare. It was a battleground here.
Ann and Mike used all the typical punishments: grounding, docked allowances, extra chores. It worked for their biological kids, but didn't seem to faze their adopted daughters. Looking back, they suspect their heavy discipline had only made things worse.
I was too insistent on my way. I needed to give way a lot more.
School was a particular hot button. Ann and Mike insisting on good grades, Sandy and Julie always falling short.
We set standards that were probably impossible for those little girls to meet.
Instead of melding into the family, the girls drifted farther away. Julie now turned into the loner, Sandy the rebel, defying her parents and teachers at every turn, and shoplifting clothes and jewelry from neighborhood stores.
She said, I can be the best at being the worst.
By 10th grade, she was failing classes left and right, and she discovered alcohol, drinking, it seemed, without limits.
We did not know what to do with Sandy. She was acting out in such self-destructive ways.
Julie briefly grabbed the spotlight again when at 16 she tried to kill herself by swallowing a handful of aspirin. And after years of eating whatever she could find, Julie suddenly became bulimic, throwing up meal after meal. Anne took her to a doctor who scared Julie into stopping. But at that point, Anne and Mike felt they were just careening from crisis to crisis and paying less attention than ever to their biological children.
We did get away with more probably than we would have. I do think that that's the case.
Now, why is that? Their transgressions were up here and yours were down here, so...
Right, there's that. And also, my parents were tired. They're tired.
So tired, something had to give. Halfway through Sandy's 10th grade year, they sent her to boarding school, hoping for a fresh start.
It was like Sandy had a chance to begin again. That's what I thought. What Sandy thought was abandoned.
What they didn't know was that Sandy's rage was building. After summer break, Anne discovered a stash of stolen merchandise in the ceiling over Sandy's bed and angry messages she'd scrawled on her mattress. It all seemed so ominous, like they'd come around a dangerous turn in the road.
I really was worried with how much hate she had inside of her because she wrote on the mattress. I couldn't imagine why she would write on the mattress. That was hard for me to understand.
Before long, Anne and Mike were fielding calls from the boarding school. Sandy was disruptive, maybe on drugs, sneaking out at night. Christmas of her junior year, the school kicked her out. Anne and Mike couldn't imagine bringing her home and couldn't find another private school that would accept her.
Truthfully, were there times along the way that you wanted to say, that's it?
Yes, we really did, and we thought seriously about terminating the arrangement.
Instead, they found a nearby home for troubled teenagers and hoped again for a new beginning. But like clockwork, the reports flooded in. Sandy was cutting classes, spitting food on people, and having sex in the parking lot. Most of all, she was furious with her parents. Mike installed deadbolts around the house, concerned Sandy would get out and come home to harm the family. A few months later, they got the call. Sandy had run away, and no one could find her. 2 weeks later, Sandy found an unlocked door at home and sneaked in. She stole things, clothes, jewelry, even kidnapped the family dog. She and the dog turned up a week later, but the episode landed her in the juvenile detention center. There, she underwent a mental health evaluation, and for the next year, bounced from one expensive mental hospital to another, each move sending her into hysterics.
She would just run wild the first few days, tear off her clothes. She was just in despair.
Eventually, there was a diagnosis: borderline personality disorder, most likely brought on by early childhood abuse. At 17, Sandy escaped and hit the road with a group of truckers. She was raped, then picked up by police and returned to the mental hospital. But just after she turned 18, the hospital's treatment limit of a year expired, and they released her. Anne and Mike desperately searched for more help, but the best place they could find was a halfway house. From there, though, it was a short trip to the streets. Sandy got hooked on crack and soon found a frightening way to support her habit.
It was a gradual move downward. We could see it coming.
To Anne and Mike's horror, Sandy, the quiet little girl who didn't like to be touched, became a prostitute.
We could see that there wasn't any other way she was going to be able to be in life. Does that make sense? She couldn't keep a job. She wanted to have something different every single day. She had to have an adventure. She loved risk, a thrill seeker.
Before long, she was arrested. Her name was in the paper.
I really felt for my father.
The view is...
By this time, Mike was a top administrator at Notre Dame, and his daughter's arrest was big news.
It was embarrassing, yeah, surely. But people were quite good. Nobody said much.
The problem is you're losing your daughter. It doesn't really matter who knows.
By then, the biological children were off to college, then graduate school, and careers. But Sandy was on a different path, a regular at the county jail, arrested 30 times in 5 years for disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and prostitution. To her family, she seemed one small step away from death.
I had a dream that I would be asked to identify her body, and I felt it, and it was like clay. And I think that's the kind of fear that a parent of a child like this has.
Julie, too, was all but lost to the family. Just before she turned 18, she left high school, moved away, and got married. After 15 years of heartache and turmoil, the adoptive daughters were finally gone, and Anne thought she might get her life back. But in her now quiet house, and to her enormous surprise, she found no relief. Instead, she missed them and began thinking about the girls without focusing on the battles.
They had great senses of humor, and they were daring and brave.
Suddenly, she realized how much she loved them. Not the automatic kind of love she felt for her biological kids, but something else, just as real.
And I think, looking back, that love comes very slowly, that they made us love them. But it was a gradual process.
A process that made her see the girls had needed much less discipline and far more love and acceptance. Looking back on that was beyond painful.
I was a failure as a mother, the thing that meant most to me. I couldn't love right, and I couldn't forgive myself.
So she started to write about her family, to search for answers, to confess, to apologize. The writings turned into a newly published book called The Limits of Hope, dedicated to her adopted daughters. To Julie, who craved what Anne couldn't give.
I think that Julie's hunger for food from the very beginning was hunger for love.
To Sandy, who had suffered so much.
We wanted me to be able to do all the things they promised, to erase it all, to take away all the pain, to love without boundaries. We wanted that, both of us, and I couldn't do it.
Could her daughters ever understand, or more importantly, forgive? One of them had by now started a new life in another state. The other was dodging the law, and neither of them wanted anything to do with their mother. So Anne set out to try to make things right, to correct what had taken root in such good intentions, but had gone so wrong.
Would Sandy and Julie ever be able to accept their mother's apology? When we return, we learn that the early abuse Sandy had suffered appeared far worse than the Luxes were told, and we hear from both sisters about life with the Lux family from their perspective.